Imagine you could build a device in your backyard this weekend using materials that cost less than a dinner out, that generates electricity so efficiently it makes your rooftop solar panels look like a very expensive joke. Not in theory, not in a lab. Right now, with a secondhand satellite dish, some reflective film from Amazon, and a small engine you can hold in one hand. And here's the part that's going to bother you for the rest of this video. In most places in the world, actually connecting that device to your home and using it to cut your electricity bill is illegal, not discouraged, not frowned upon. Illegal. We're going to get into why that is, who benefits from keeping it that way, and whether there's anything you can actually do about it today. Let's start with the technology itself, because most people have never heard of it, and that's part of the problem. A parabolic dish concentrator works on an almost embarrassingly simple principle. You take a curved reflective surface, shaped like a satellite dish or a bowl, and you point it at the sun. Because of the geometry of a parabola, every ray of sunlight that hits that dish gets reflected toward a single point in the center called the focal point. At that focal point, temperatures can reach anywhere from 300 to over 1,000 degrees Celsius, depending on the size and quality of the dish. You then place a small engine at that focal point, and you use that heat to generate electricity. That's it. That's the whole concept. No exotic materials, no rare earth minerals, no factory the size of a small city to manufacture the components. The engine most commonly used in these systems is called a Stirling engine. It was invented in 1816 by a Scottish minister named Robert Stirling, which tells you something important. This is not cutting-edge technology that still needs decades of development. It is a 200-year-old invention that works on the principle of alternately heating and cooling a gas inside a cylinder to drive a piston. Stirling engines are quiet, they have very few moving parts, they require almost no maintenance, and when paired with a parabolic concentrator, they can achieve thermal to electrical conversion efficiencies of 25 to 31%. Compare that to the typical residential solar panel you might have on your roof right now, which converts sunlight to electricity at around 18 to 22% efficiency on a good day, and you start to understand why the numbers look so dramatic when people compare the two technologies. The dish Stirling system is not just slightly better. Under direct sunlight conditions, it is genuinely one of the most efficient ways to convert solar energy into usable electricity that exists today. Now let's talk about cost, because this is where it gets interesting and where a lot of the online conversation around this technology turns into something between legitimate outrage and pure hype. The claim you'll see repeated endlessly is that you can build one of these systems for $15. That number is technically possible if you already own everything except the reflective material, you find a discarded satellite dish for free, and your time has no value. Even at the higher end of that range, when you divide the cost by the amount of electricity the system will produce over its lifetime, the cost per kilowatt hour is dramatically lower than utility electricity in most countries and competitive with or better than residential solar panels when you factor in that panels degrade over time, and this system has almost nothing to degrade. The core components of a Stirling engine, if well built, can last decades with minimal upkeep. So why doesn't everyone have one of these in their backyard? Why aren't companies selling polished consumer versions at every hardware store? This is the question that sends people down a rabbit hole, and the answer is uncomfortable because it doesn't fit neatly into either the conspiracy narrative or the techno-optimist story. The truth is a combination of regulatory barriers, infrastructure logic, industry incentives, and genuine technical challenges that don't make for clean villains or clean heroes. Start with the legal side. In most countries, there is no law that says you cannot build a parabolic dish concentrator and use it to heat water, cook food, or run an off-grid device. You can do all of that completely legally in the vast majority of jurisdictions. The problem arises the moment you want to connect that system to your home's electrical grid or to any system that is connected to the grid. Grid-tied electrical generation is heavily regulated almost everywhere for reasons that are partly legitimate and partly about protecting the interests of established utilities. The legitimate reasons include safety, such as improperly connected generation equipment can create dangerous backfeed situations that put utility workers at risk, and grid stability, since large numbers of uncoordinated small generators can create real management problems. The less legitimate reasons include the fact that utility companies in many places have spent decades lobbying for regulations that make it difficult, expensive, and bureaucratically painful to generate your own power and reduce your dependence on them. In the United States, for example, connecting any generation system to the grid requires passing through a series of interconnection approvals, inspections, and often the purchase of specific certified inverters and protection equipment that can cost more than the generation system itself. The rules vary enormously by state and even by utility district. In some places, the process is relatively streamlined. In others, it is deliberately designed to be expensive and time-consuming enough that most homeowners give up. Similar dynamics play out across Europe, Asia, and Latin America. The technology is not illegal. The paperwork required to use it in the most convenient way often is not worth fighting through. There is also a more structural issue. The electricity grid was built around the assumption of large, centralized power plants feeding power outward to passive consumers. That model is profitable and manageable. Millions of small, independent generators that produce power intermittently and in varying amounts is a genuinely harder engineering problem, and the infrastructure to handle it well is still being built. Net metering policies, smart grid technologies, and updated interconnection standards are slowly making distributed generation more feasible, but slowly is the operative word. The solar panel industry itself is worth mentioning here, not as a villain, but as a factor. Rooftop solar has received enormous investment, regulatory support, and consumer marketing over the past 2 decades. That investment shaped regulations, incentives, and standards around photovoltaic technology specifically. Dish Stirling systems, which are potentially more efficient in the right conditions, but require tracking mechanisms to follow the sun and work best in high direct sunlight environments, never received the same level of institutional support. Large-scale Dish Stirling projects were tested and then abandoned by utilities, not because the technology failed, but because the economics of utility-scale solar shifted dramatically toward flat panels, which became cheaper faster than anyone predicted. The result is a technology that works, that has been proven at scale, and that has almost no institutional infrastructure supporting its adoption at the residential level. So, where does that leave you if you're someone who wants to actually use this? The most legally straightforward application right now is off-grid use. If you have a rural property, a cabin, a workshop, or any space that is not connected to the utility grid, you can build a Dish Stirling system or a simpler parabolic thermal system, use it to generate electricity stored in batteries, and face essentially no regulatory barriers in most places. The system legitimately can replace or dramatically reduce your dependence on diesel generators or expensive grid extension. For people living in high sunlight regions and paying very high electricity prices, the economics are compelling right now without any change in regulations. For grid-connected homes, The practical advice is less exciting but important. Research your specific local interconnection rules before investing significant time or money. In some jurisdictions, there are simplified procedures for very small generation systems below a certain wattage threshold. Some areas have community solar or cooperative generation frameworks that provide a legal path for technologies that aren't specifically listed in standard residential solar regulations. If you're technically inclined and comfortable with off-grid battery systems, a small parabolic thermal system feeding a battery bank that then powers certain loads in your home through a separate circuit is another way to get real benefit without navigating the most complex parts of grid interconnection. What's actually stopping broader adoption long-term is not the fundamental physics or the cost of the technology. It is the absence of standardized, certified, consumer-ready systems that come with pre-approved interconnection documentation the way that grid-tied solar inverters do today. That gap exists because no major manufacturer has yet decided the residential dish Stirling market is large enough to invest in creating that ecosystem, and that market will not grow large enough to attract that investment until the ecosystem exists. It is a chicken and egg problem, not a conspiracy. Though it is worth noting that the egg was placed very deliberately in a particular nest by people who had strong financial reasons to do so. The technology works. The physics is sound. The cost advantages are real under the right conditions, and the barriers, while not imaginary, are regulatory and economic rather than fundamental. Whether that makes you frustrated or hopeful probably depends on your temperament. What it should make you is informed, because that is where every useful change in energy policy has ever started.